I want to talk about something that's always bothered me on some level, and I think it bothers a lot of people, if it doesn't perhaps bother most to some degree. In short, it's the question of good and evil, which is so much more than it appears to be on the surface. The question of good and evil worms itself down into every inch of our perception of reality, so that it may color an otherwise beautiful view of a city or a natural scene. That's why most religions are obsessed with their answers to this question, and are often also built around it. The question of good and evil, which is notoriously uncomfortable to face, can create a persistent experience of low-grade anxiety as long as it remains unresolved. I think we therefore often feel better and are better able to focus when we think through things like the question of good and evil that might be bothering us. Our need to contemplate universal questions is, after all, part of what draws us to everything that is reflective, from religion to literature and science. There is part of us that needs these questions to be answered satisfactorily. I found some interesting answers to the question of good and evil not only in Christianity, the literary and artistic traditions of the West, and Eastern cultures, but also in non-mainstream experiences. I found the Indian tribes of the Colombian Amazon, who were studied by Richard Evans Schultz starting in 1941, particularly interesting, because this was a time when they were among the groups least influenced by modern culture due to their geographical isolation, living a subsistence lifestyle in the most biodiverse landscape on Earth, where they constantly experienced up close what life is actually like when the layer of civilization is removed. The question of good and evil is derived from the natural world. It's acknowledged in both scientific and religious contexts that the question of good and evil is fundamentally derived from the natural world. The Christian culture, for instance, works from the basic supposition that the world is fallen, and essentially that evil reigns supreme on the earth, and it uses natural imagery, such as that found in the foundational story of the Garden of Eden, including the apple and the serpent, to link the question of good and evil to the natural world. According to this tradition, the world became a fallen place after Adam and Eve were seduced and manipulated by the serpent, and we have since come to live on the planet where Jesus was crucified by bureaucrats and soldiers, and therefore the best we can achieve is to aspire to do good. We will inevitably fail, however, and be forgiven for our sins, because Jesus is a forgiving God who acknowledges that we really do live in a fallen world. The Christian sect of the Gnostics goes into greater detail and intrigue regarding the link between the question of good and evil and nature, by describing our world as a realm that is governed by the demiurge, a supernatural entity known as the God below God, who has the body of a serpent and the head of a lion, and who is the creator of material reality and responsible for maintaining it. One of the interesting things about the demiurge is that, even though he is evil, he is subservient to God with a capital G. The question of good and evil in popular culture. In the West, we also grow up with non-biblical stories of good and evil, such as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, both of which explore the psychology and deeper spiritual significance of good and evil, and, like the Bible, they identify power and greed as being central to the problem. Tolkien's masterpiece, of course, is centered around Frodo's quest to destroy the Ring of Power, which is known as the One Ring to rule them all, before Sauron and his forces of evil can acquire it. Everything's at stake, because the forces of evil are burning down the entire world and turning it into a wasteland. In Harry Potter, the forces of evil, principally power and greed, reach their epitome in the antagonist of the story, Lord Voldemort, and they are counteracted by Harry Potter's heroic characteristics of love, friendship, loyalty, and courage. It's worth noting that reptiles, including serpents and dragons, feature prominently in these franchises, including The Hobbit, which is the prequel to the Lord of the Rings series, echoing the imagery of the serpent in the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. It metaphorically represents the selfish and greedy pursuit of wealth and power at all costs, which therefore involves slyness, lies, misdirection, betrayal, and violence. Reptiles, because of their characteristically solitary, pragmatic, and brutal existence, are a good analogy for selfish, egotistical, and narcissistic human behaviors, and it also illustrates how we're conforming to this basic substrate of nature itself when we're channeling these personality types and behaviors. A return to fundamentals. The Western literary and religious traditions typically only take us so far in understanding the question of good and evil, however, because they mostly refer to nature and the wilderness metaphorically. They don't give us the grounded sense of life on Earth, outside the trappings of civilization, that we need to understand why evil should prevail on the planet, and why it therefore seems to be baked into our reality. One of the best descriptions of the question of good and evil, and how it relates to the natural world, that I've encountered, comes from a non-Western tradition that is mostly unknown to us in the West, that of Indian tribes in the Colombian Amazon. These tribes, who had been living intimately with the rainforest for untold generations by the time they were studied, used the image of Wagti, the dark spirit of the earth, to represent the fundamental life force of the rainforest that produces not only the bounty and beauty, but also the danger and horror therein. The danger and horror that we encounter in the natural world are mostly due to the norm of predation and exploitation. Paul Rosalie, the American explorer famous for his adventures in the Amazon, calls the rainforest, albeit affectionately, a giant meat grinder, which gets at the heart of why the Indian tribes identify the life force of the forest as evil. In this world, everything, including plants, herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, are eventually consumed by everything else in an endless, narcissistic competition over resources. The Amazon rainforest was also memorably described by German documentary filmmaker Werner Herzog, who used evocative words and phrases like obscene, overwhelming collective murder, and misery to describe his surroundings when he spent time there. Our civilization is also based on selfish competition over resources. This description of the natural world brings into perspective our own world, in which we, like the animals in the jungle, each fight for our share of the pie. It makes it obvious why evil is built into the foundation of our world, and therefore why egotistical personality traits, such as pride, greed, and wrath, are so ubiquitous and prominent. We are genetically identical, for all intents and purposes, to our hunter-gatherer and tribal forebears, and our civilization, like the natural world, is based on a form of cooperation that relies on selfish competition over resources. In natural ecosystems, each species, and each individual and group within that species, serve the whole of the ecosystem while yet wholeheartedly pursuing their own selfish goals within it, the most basic of which have to do with their survival and reproduction. Even when they are reproducing, they are satisfying the drives and urges of their bodies, and yet the result is that they are serving the reproductive cycle of the natural world, and maintaining the quality of the gene pool. In the capitalist system, cooperation based on selfish competition over resources boils down to the pursuit of money. The only legitimate way to make money in the capitalist system is to deliver services or products to others for which they are willing to pay, and yet everyone in the system ultimately focuses on their own self-interest. There are, of course, however, three fundamental differences between natural ecosystems and modern civilization. Many species are involved in natural ecosystems like those in the Amazon, as opposed to our exclusively human society. The organisms in a natural ecosystem serve the whole of nature completely unconsciously, as opposed to us humans, who consciously contribute to society through our paid work, and our civilization is man-made and designed to serve us, and not some bigger concept of nature and life that is larger than our species. The reality, however, is, of course, that most people don't think about their contribution to society very deeply or for very long, if they do so at all. Society is, to a large extent, driven by selfishness and greed, because that's what we're basing the world upon, the pursuit of money and power above all else. What are the consequences of basing our civilization on selfish competition over resources? This type of system, where selfish interests are bent to a common goal, is ingenious, but it has major pitfalls. The most obvious is having to live in a narcissistic and egotistical society where everyone is selfish, predatory, exploitative, and manipulative. The worst types of narcissists are typically amongst those who rise to power in systems that are based on hierarchies and competitions, because their personalities are based on the same basic principles of nature, largely greed and the pursuit of power. Narcissistic behavior becomes a particularly pernicious problem in the wildly enabling environment of the modern economy, within which humans are literally considered human resources, as opposed, naturally, to non-human resources. There are, of course, Many ways resources can be used and abused, depending on the intentions, priorities, powers, and perspectives of the users, which is already set up by the modern environment to be unsentimental and, independently from variations in personality, becomes even less sentimental the further out you draw the circle around any individual person and their immediate family and friends. We have worked countermeasures into our modern system so that our civilization and survival and competition within it is not quite as brutal and excessive as that found in the natural world. Examples include principles of good sportsmanship, courts of justice, the pursuit of ethical business practices, and cultural and personal practices of generosity and openness. We also still have our social impulses of love, friendship, and cooperation, and in the West, we have Christianity. These are, nevertheless, only ideals to which we aspire, while in reality, the Christian West has a conflicted relationship with the law of nature. Most modern Christians are, of course, tempted to worship the law of nature instead of devoting themselves to Christianity, seeing that's what material reality, including nature and our civilization, is based upon, and therefore what's pragmatic and effective to achieve your materialistic goals. This is a very human temptation, which is openly encouraged in many other cultural traditions, which basically worship the law of nature and also death. The Christian West, on the other hand, has traditionally been an example of a transcendent and aspirational culture, at least on Sundays, that nevertheless, ironically and also openly, worships money and power the rest of the week. The irony seems to be that you have to obey the law of nature, at least to some extent, to survive and thrive personally, and for your good intentions to have an impact on the material conditions of people's lives. For the same reasons, the Indians of the Colombian Amazon have a conflicted and ambiguous relationship with Bhakti. They don't worship Bhakti, even though it represents the life force that supplies the beauty and bounty of the rainforest, but they nevertheless provide offerings to propitiate the fundamentally evil forces of nature, asking it favors to provide for them and spare them from harm. They dedicate their lives, however, to the spirit of the sun, which they, similar to Christians who worship the Son of God, associate with the light and with the good and pure principles that guide their lives. It's no mystery why our world appears to be a paradise and a place of plenty that, at the same time, is full of the kind of stuff that is best described as evil. We are, after all, basing our society on the forces of Bhakti, which are based on selfish competition over resources. But what, exactly, is our justification for acting and living according to the primordial dictates of nature if it causes so much suffering in addition to the bounty it produces? Can we not envision an approach that is more sensible than our current compromise with the law of nature? In the West, the official answer to this question is based on a secular belief system that was established during the Enlightenment era, which reflects our ambiguous relationship with Bhakti and the life force by claiming that we need capitalism, and therefore the individualistic pursuit of money and power, to develop utopia on the material level, which is complemented by our ongoing pursuit of God on the spiritual level. Where do we go from here? All cultural groups have religions and mythologies to help them navigate questions of good and evil, and in the West, Christianity has done a good job of helping us aspire to something more civilized than the brutality of the natural principles upon which our world is based. The Christian West is, nevertheless, able to maintain an ambiguous attitude within which individual people and the institutions they run wholeheartedly pursue money and power despite their aspirational sentiments, which they typically use self-righteously to justify why they, and not somebody else, should have the money and power. We are therefore basing our civilization on the same forces of nature that the South American Indians describe as Bhakti, or cutting a deal with the horned god in the wilderness, as modern American film tropes like to depict it, which in the Christian tradition is the same as making a deal with the devil. All of these metaphors point to this underlying relationship with the ruthless, bloodthirsty spirit of nature that is, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously described it, red in tooth and claw, and is based on a system of selfish competition over resources that, harnessed by our civilization, produces both the fruits on which we sustain ourselves and much of the horrors that we witness. In the West, we have identified God as the higher thing that we aspire to, but I think it's just as important that we invoke the context of what we're actually responding to with our spiritual and religious instincts. The question of good and evil, which is derived from the ambiguity of the life force, and which brings with it the great power and peril, beauty and misery that we face as a species.
All the peoples and civilizations of the earth are forced to make a deal with Bhakti, and we therefore need to make a compromise with the fact that the life force of the planet is, upon closer examination, not always as beautiful as it appears to be on the surface. Especially in this day and age, with the technological powers that we are amassing, it's a good idea that we start working on getting this part of the deal right by fostering self-awareness in ourselves and in our relationships. We should facilitate the life force to work for us, like we might work with the natural current of a river to harness its power, but we should take care not to capitulate and lose control by staying aware that we are dealing with Bhakti, which is fundamentally an evil force as much as it can be made to work for good. If anything, this leaves me in a contemplative place, which is exactly where we need to be to sustain the right approach to life and answer to the question of good and evil. In life, we always need to create some distance, pause and calm to come to the right understanding and to make the right choice. In the West, we have been using natural principles, like cooperation based on selfish competition over resources, to evolve our culture and civilization rapidly, and we have tapped into the underlying power of the earth and the universe with our sciences. But what are we trying to build for the future, and what kind of world do we want in the meantime? If anything, it's clearly necessary that we consciously pursue certain counter-arguments and thrusts in our culture when, as a society, we are dealing with the forces of Bhakti. Maybe that's a good place to leave off for now, because hopefully, if I've done my job, we have arrived at the same place, and I don't want to be prescriptive about the kind of world that you might want to inhabit.